Spring 1942. Chester Nimitz, U.S. Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific, decides to send a carrier strike group to the Coral Sea after getting an alert from American radio intelligence. Admiral Yamamoto plans to more or less attack the Americans in the Central Pacific. The Japanese plan to establish strong holds on New Guinea and the Solomon Islands to cement their territory, but it's here that the Americans lie in ambush. It was the first sea battle in history that was fought at such long distance, and using planes exclusively. The staring fleets never came into vision of each other. The war of the aircraft carriers had begun. The enemies launched their squadrons. Nearly simultaneously, they met above the Coral Sea. The battle lasted for 2 days. The Americans sunk the Japanese carrier Shoho and inflicted heavy damage on Japan's brand new carrier Shokaku, a third Japanese carrier. The Shokaku lost virtually all its aircraft. The Americans also took a real beating. The carrier Lexington sunk and Yorktown was heavily damaged, but the Japanese advance was stopped with their attack on Pearl Harbor. In a few short months, the sleeping giant that was the United States had been roused and was now hungry for revenge. The American industry had shifted production to military hardware. It was a new class of aircraft carriers that was supposed to restore dominion for the US, especially in the Pacific. The ships were fast, had a long range, and could carry up to 100 planes via the Panama Canal. The Americans pushed unit after unit into the Pacific. And they enjoyed a nefarious advantage, having cracked the Japanese encryption. US codebreakers were now able to decode the bulk of Japanese communications, and in doing so, staved off additional surprise attacks. Another scene of engagement was set on a pinprick of land in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. The Battle of Midway, the U.S. naval base in Midway and Japan, prepared to lure the Americans into a pitched battle with the diversionary strikes in the Aleutian Islands. And taking Midway Island here, Admiral Yamamoto was prepared to finish what Pearl Harbor had not started: the total destruction of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. On the 4th of June 1942, the attack on Midway was in full swing. The radio reconnaissance on the part of the enemy had rendered Commander Yamamoto's plans empty. For the enemy was ready 3 aircraft carriers: the Sweep, the Enterprise, and the Yorktown, which had been rapidly fixed after the honorary Battle of the Coral Sea, lay 300 miles northeast of the atoll. Commander Yamamoto and Admiral Nagumo, the commanding officer of his aircraft carriers fleet, were utterly oblivious of how well the enemy had come. Offensive, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft did, however, report enemy fleets. The timestamp of this transmission was too late for the radio to warn the Navy of the opposing aircraft carriers. Chaos reigned on board. The Japanese aircraft carriers, they now had to be ready to refit Nagumo's planes to deal with naval targets. But Yamamoto's battleships could not come to assist. The whole American attack was uncoordinated, with all torpedo bombers wasted in the first wave. With dive bombers nonetheless, being able to destroy 3 of the 4 aircraft carriers within hours: Akagi, Kaga, and the Soryu. In the afternoon of the 4th, the Americans even managed to sink the last of the carriers, Hiryu for Commander Yamamoto. All plans were lost, and the retreat commenced. Americans were on the advance. The direction was New Guinea, but it wasn't long until U.S. reconnaissance began to sight the newly built airfield on the redoubt of the island of Guadalcanal, an essential target upon which U.S. supply lines could be threatened. No more was air dominance key than in the Pacific, and the airfield at Guadalcanal was a powerful piece in this game. Thus, the American higher commands ordered their troops to undertake an assault on the island and capture the Japanese airstrip operation. Watchtower ensued as 19,000 Marines deployed to the islands of the Solomons. The goal to clear the Kingdom of Japan from both Guadalcanal and Leyte to the north. Still, it was a small landing party that was tasked with these goals. The United States was now in a war that would span across 2 oceans. Germany first was the order to Allies. As per its global strategy, only after the victory against the Nazis would there be resources to turn towards the Pacific theater. The troops knew little about the islands, and accurate maps had yet to be drawn up. The persecution of them set out to be the first deployment for many of the 19,000 Marines, many of whom were very young. A fleet of 3 aircraft carriers and the battleship North Carolina, led by Admiral Frank Fletcher, then protected those stranded behind them on that lonely day, the 7th of August, 1942. The operation began in the early mornings as shells were fired. The coast of Guadalcanal for the Americans on the journey was unclear what awaited them on that sandy beach, nor the large amount of geography that had defended the landing sectors, or the scene that awaited them at the jungle's edge, or whether or not them along 19,000 men would survive or die within hours, had no reason to suspect that the battle for the island of Guadalcanal would go down in history as one of the bloodiest in the Pacific War. At 9 a.m., the 1st Marines landed ashore on Red Beach, the name allocated by U.S. strategists. The Marines met little resistance on the beach itself, as the Japanese defenders had retreated into the jungle, where they suffered heavy losses due to the advancing American troops. By the next day, the U.S. Marines had already seized control of the airfield. They called it Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, who fell during the Battle of Midway, and then they went in pursuit of the other troops in the following night. And in the days to come, there were again hard-fought naval battles at sea, and several American cruisers were sunk by the Japanese ships. The Battle of Savo Island is considered the greatest defeat of the U.S. Navy during the Second World War in the hinterland and jungle of Guadalcanal. The soldiers fought bloody hand-to-hand battles, and in the end, in November 1942, the Marines finally gained the upper hand in Guadalcanal. Elsewhere in the world, the destruction of the 6th Army was coming to a halt in Stalingrad. The Russians had expelled General Rommel from Egypt, and while the U.S. drove out the remaining Japanese from Guadalcanal, the Allies landed on the North African coast, and the Americans, British, and French forces worked together to gain control over Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. Was losing the initiative in Europe. In the Pacific, the U.S. forces took their opportunities that they really got to take the initiative in an all-out offensive against the Japanese Empire. Really, from this point on, November 1942 will go down as the turning point in the Second World War. and the US now had a stronghold with Guadalcanal. Their air force also dominated the Solomon Island, but at what price? The price was blood. The American loss of almost 7,000 men for the island in its battle. The Japanese. There were double the amount of casualty noticed. As for the island's airfield, and unknown to the Japanese High Command, it had lost its biggest asset to the battle for supremacy in the Pacific. American codebreakers had cracked the radio message that revealed Admiral Yamamoto was due to be in the region. So US commanding officers decided to intercept his plane.